Okay, so here we are reviewing a paper called Attention is All You Need. So, why you don't need power, money, love, recurrent neural networks? We're gonna find out now. Attention is all you need. Alright, so in this paper, we have to keep in mind it was written in 2017, which in NLP terms is a long time ago, mostly thanks to this paper itself, because this paper describes something called transformers. And transformers, well, they're more than meets the eye, indeed, because they first were applied to basically translating things between two languages, and then it became more and more obvious that having one sequence transformed into another sequence effectively can do a lot more, because many things can be turned into sequences. Images, audio of all kinds, music, stock market information, really many things. So the whole community was very surprised by this, and let me just go into detail about what transformers really are. So transformers in neural network world would be called a prior. Now a prior really is something that you know a priori, you know ahead of time, is a pretty good design for the job you have at hand. And transformers themselves are not terribly intuitive. Actually, they take a little bit of explanation to really understand. But here is a much more intuitive prior that was discovered much earlier on in the history of neural networks. It's a convolutional neural network, which works for images. So it was promoted heavily and researched heavily by LeCun, who became famous for it. He did a lot of other stuff too. So not so fast if you think you can just invent one thing and get away with it. You have to do many things. But anyhow, there were people before him who had these ideas, but he really pushed them. And the idea is actually fairly simple. You have something like a kernel, something like a grid of pixels, and each pixel value is connected by a weight to like a neuron, which is going to go off or it's not going to go off. Okay, so this little grid here is maybe a grid that detects something that's very common in images, such as an eye, because we usually take images of people, animals, things like that. So when this grid is actually applied, it's applied again and again and again to see and check if another segment, like this segment, doesn't have an eye, this segment doesn't have an eye, this segment doesn't have an eye, and then you can practically create a whole new image here by going through this image like this. You can create a whole new image here that tells you whether or not there was an eye in the image, or where there was likely an eye in the image. In fact, you can do this not just at this scale. You can rescale the image and then go through it with the same detector again and again and again, because the eye can appear at many scales. So why is this so useful? Well, for one thing, this actually allows us to detect patterns in images. Like, we don't need to see eyes in every part of the image. We just need to see eyes enough to actually train this, or one of these detectors, to detect an eye. Okay, and there's other detectors for other things. So we need less data, but secondly, we need much less computation, because we're only detecting for a grid of these connections. We're not detecting for what we would otherwise be having to detect, is all of these weights for the entire image, an image worth of these grids, which is really a bad idea. So it saves an enormous amount of computational time and an enormous amount of data as well. So why can we do this? Because we understand what the data really looks like. What we understand that there is an inherent property about images that allows this prior neural model to actually do a good job of cutting down on the data requirements and computational requirements. All right, so what does the transformer do then? Well, a transformer has basically done the same thing for translations initially, but later it was generalized to all sorts of sequences. But wait a minute, this was published in 2017, but back when people rode on steamships to go to work in some year long ago, 2016, things worked a little bit differently. And people used recurrent neural networks back then. And recurrent neural networks were in fact work something like this. So you have a word here represented by some vector, and it gets fed into the recurrent neural network, and then the internal representation of the recurrent neural network changes. Then we move on to the next step. In the next step, we feed the next word. Okay, so in this case, it might be turn light on, or turn lights on, and then here it would be hoi dang in Cantonese, and so here we would basically have this word light would be here being fed into the neural network, and then that would be changing the internal representation, and then on would be turning would be going on here, changing the internal representation. Then we have this internal representation create a vector, but actually the internal representation itself could be this very same vector that's been changing all along. And then what we do is we have a decoder. So this was an encoder stage, and then we have a decoder stage where we just take this and we do turn this vector into hoi representation, and then go to the next stage where we usually actually feed in what we just generated so that we know where we are in the sentence, and then we also feed it the internal representation, which may have changed, or we may actually do something like this. We may take this and we feed it to every single step of the decoding process. Okay, that's also oftentimes done in the past, but in this design it was discovered that it would be advantageous if we paid attention to certain parts of this vector and certain parts of the computation at particular times. So we could detect at what time certain, or under what circumstances should certain parts of this vector have greater weight. Okay, and this was something that came to be known as attention. Okay, and attention then started getting to be a more and more elaborate concept, until effectively somebody finally came up with the idea of just saying, we don't really need power, money, love, or recurrent neural networks. Attention is all we need. And then we use the attention mechanism, and this effectively we feed it like I am a student in French here, and then attention mechanism turns this sentence into some kind of encoding and further encoding and further encoding and so on, until you have this, I guess, high level encoding of some kind, and then that is passed on in the original concept, that is passed on to every single decoder that but the decoders themselves are stacked up, and they pass on this decoding of a sequence sequentially. And all of this decoding and encoding is achieved by means of attention. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this particular picture is that it's actually too complicated. You can look at the more complicated version of it here. This just depicts one layer of encoding and one layer of decoding, and this it looks intimidating at the very beginning, but it's not so scary. There's a softmax here, there's a linear layer here, a linear neural network layer here, so that's not scary. Feed forward neural network, okay, we can later figure out how that fits into the picture. There's a element-wise addition and then later a normalization. Okay, so that's how we connect whatever comes out of here with the results of the feed forward. Okay, that's not so hard. Same thing here, here, and here. So what exactly are the difficult steps? Well, there's this tau symbol here, and it's called positional encoding. And what that is about is going to be explained, but that's something that's not that challenging. The real meat and potatoes of this whole algorithm lies in this multi-head attention. It shows up here and here, so both in the encoding and the decoding steps it shows up. And actually the input gets split into 3 pieces, and there's some very good reasons as to why that takes place. So before we go any further, I should let you know that if we take just the encoders, for example, and we go here, just the encoders, just this stack of encoders, we forget about this whole business here, everything here, just forget about it. And then we take this sentence, same sentence, we put it here, okay, except we replace some characters for a particular word with characters that have a special meaning that say that means basically guess the characters of this in these places. Guess which characters in these places, and then the encoder stack goes to do its job and starts guessing. And by the magic of backpropagation, eventually you end up with something that can do a pretty good job of filling out blanks in sentences. And that model is actually mostly what's called BERT, the BERT model. And it does amazing things because in order to achieve that fill in the blank business, it actually has to understand the model at a fairly sophisticated level. But actually, you can achieve something very similar with this decoder. If you basically feed in something like I am a student here, and you forget about all of this stuff on this side. Okay, so you just have decoders. You just say I am a student, and you just feed it through the decoder network. It will try to predict the next word. So I am a student, and then it will try to probably predict like of mathematics, of history. So this particular architecture is very good at generating all kinds of text. Once you feed it enough text, like they've been feeding such algorithms more and more text. They're called GPT, actually. You may have heard of it. Once you feed it so much text, it basically gets to be really good at predicting what is the next word. And in order to achieve that, it actually has to have a pretty good understanding of the language itself, and in some ways also an understanding to a degree of how the world itself works. So that is the business of that. Now, hold on a minute. All right, so when we go back to this picture, and we have to take a look first at the encoders themselves. If we just look at the encoders themselves, they're simpler than the decoders. Okay, so if we understand the encoders, basically the same principles are the ones that work to make the decoder work. So let's just take a look at the encoders, and let's take a look at the first weird part about the encoders. We have this thing called positional encoding. Okay, now we happen to have it as well in the decoders, so let's figure out what that is. It's got this tau symbol. So I don't know if it discovered Taoism, but it didn't. It's something else. What it is, it's basically, you have to notice that in these types of models, you basically feed all of the whole sentence in at once. It's not like a recurrent neural network where you depend on time. In a recurrent neural network, you feed one word after another at a time. And these transformers, you basically transform the entire sequence at once. Now, there is a consequence that follows with that, and that is the fact that our transformer is not very well aware of which word is the first one, which word is the second one. The positioning of the ordering of the words is not very well defined. Now, you could say that each word, which is defined by its token, okay, and there's a whole business of how you tokenize a sentence. Okay, you can tokenize it by words, or you can tokenize it by down to character level, like you can tokenize it by each character, or you can tokenize it something like in the middle where you take the endings off, and the endings are their own thing. So like swim ing and run ing, and actually this particular process is called stemming. Nonetheless, we have these tokens one after another, but the algorithm is not aware of the order, and it's not designed to take advantage of the fact that they're probably going to be placed, or that at least you can place them in a particular order. It just doesn't care. It sees them all coming in at once, and there is a kind of a positioning information that needs to get mixed in with each word. And the way that it's done, okay, I'm going to steal this from a presentation from Yannick Klitscher, whose name I butchered, and I'm going to show you how you can take 3 bits. So this is like 3 bits, and if you consider this to be a soft version of a binary counter, so this is the most significant bit. Okay, this is this here down here is the least significant bit. The least significant bit flips on and off really slowly, fast, and the most significant bit goes really slowly. Now, these are actually sine waves. So when you have 3 bits in a binary world, you can count up to 8, because that's 2 to the 3rd. But with these sine waves, there's a softness to the whole thing. So actually, there's like this is the period of the whole thing, of the most significant bit. So actually, if you cut anywhere here, it's a unique combination of numbers, of 3 numbers. But the reality is that you're gonna have to these tokens are probably going to be more than 3 bits, and basically these positioning vectors are going to be actually the same size as the token vector size. Okay, so let's just say you have, I don't know, you have 12 tokens to position, and it's no big deal if you position them like here somewhere within the first period. They're all going to have unique signatures, but the way that the 2 things are mixed in together is kind of unique. You add element by element. So this element, the first number in the vector is added to the first number in this vector. So, and then you get a result. And so you do this for each position in the vector, and you do this for every single combination of token and positioning vector, and you get the new representation. Okay, so those are your new positioned tokens. Okay, and going back to here, so now we know what happens when you do this addition thing here, element-wise addition thing. So we don't need to worry about that. So what is really left to worry about here? Really, it's mostly these orange, calm orange happy boxes with, let's say, multi-head attention. We need to know what those things really do. And what's interesting is that there's actually 3 inputs that go into these boxes. Okay, so on a high level, I'm going to go through and show you what happens in an encoder. Okay, so that's this part right here. Okay, so a little story about that. We have a sentence initially. Okay, we keep talking about these sentences, and now they're turned into these positioned tokenized vectors, but it's still a sentence, some kind of sequence. And the happy box is this multi-head attention is going to turn this one sequence into a multitude of sequences. Now, what are those sequences about? Well, they can actually represent many things. They can vary from the original sequence in terms of both values that are represented. So, for example, we can talk about, whereas these are words of some kind, these would be maybe grammatical notations such as verbs, nouns, adverbs, whatever. So that would be there, and or you can have like sentiment or whatever. And you can also flip the ordering around of these things. So you can have the same sentence, but you flip the ordering of the words around. Why would you do that? Well, some languages have inherently different order. Actually, Cantonese and English have different order. One is SVO, one is SOV. And so you generate these multiple sequences, okay, and then you concatenate them together into a really long sequence, and you put that through well, here it's denoted as a neural network with multiple layers, but actually it's a neural network with a single layer that would end up giving you a sequence that would be the same size sequence as the original sentence that you put in. So then you do this add and norm, which is in this happy blue. Well, blue is not originally happy, but whatever. Not too depressed blue add and norm letters. So that happens here. So we add and norm this and this. Okay, so why would you take something that you had before, the whole business of computing this, and then just put it into the result of this computation? Well, initially this whole thing, all right, is going to be generating all sorts of nonsense. So for the most part, your best bet would probably be to just transmit whatever you were fed in, and you get a pretty bad score, but not so bad compared to what you would otherwise get if you just rely on this. But at a later time, when you get some confidence on how this is performing, this starts to gain higher and higher values compared to this, and then this becomes mostly what this is all about. And then, all right, after explaining what the add and norm here does, we take this sequence, which is the same length as this sequence, and then we put that through a proper feed-forward neural network, and that is actually a multi-layer feed-forward neural network, properly drawn here. And then we have a new sequence, which is actually, again, the same size as the original and the same size as this one. And then we do another add and norm. So for the same reasons, because initially this would be generating nonsense. So basically you would just be wanting to skip like this, and then just pretend everything's okay, even though you're not doing much. But the backpropagation should be giving you some very valuable information about how to adjust these parameters and these parameters here to get better results. And then eventually your information flow is probably mostly going like this. Okay, so that's the add and norm business. What happens here and here? So we've gone from some kind of input embedding to positional encoding. Adding the positional encoding, and then we take that, we throw that into the multi-head attention. There is a reason why there's 3 things here. We'll go into that later. This multi-head attention just generates a whole lot of things. Those get concatenated together, put through a single layer neural network. Then they get added and normed with the original, and that gets split into being added and normed with a feed-forward version of the thing. So that's the encoder. And the decoder, you will actually be able to figure it out by following the logic. But at this point, actually, there's still very good open questions, like what is this trident here, and why is it feeding it into this mysterious multi-head attention? And you'll have to bear with me, because this requires the usage of proper terms and the consistent usage of proper terms. So it's easy to mess this explanation up, but here we go at it anyways. First of all, when we are giving it the tokens, we give that happy orange box the tokens, and now we're going to go into explaining why we have those 3 arrows for each token. Okay, for each token and for each so-called multi-head. Okay, so what are we talking about multi-heads here? Well, here later on this is depicted as like multi-heads, like that many things are in parallel. Okay, but that's the same thing as what I was talking about back actually here. Okay, so when you generate many sequences. Okay, so this is just for one sequence. Okay, for one of these sequences that you're going to generate, for each token you're going to have to generate 3 values before the fun even begins. Now, why do you need to do that? What is that all about? Well, you can think of these tokens as being in some kind of embedding space, and then to generate these 3 new vectors, okay, you're going to have to put the original token through a weight matrix, and that basically puts the original token into another kind of embedding space. You can think of it as being put into another embedding space of some kind. It's not a terribly complicated transformation. It's possible there's better ways that are going to be discovered down the road, but right now just the weight matrix gets the job done really well. And then what you have is a weight matrix for something called a value, something called a key, and something called a query. Okay, now what is the value? Okay, and what is these keys and queries? Well, value, okay, is going to help you change the meaning of your sequence. So for example, if you are going from words to grammatical terms, that this value, okay, is going to probably represent something like a verb, noun, something like that, okay. And these keys and queries are going to help you change the order of the words around. Now, how that happens is actually very interesting, and it's a very complicated, well, it's one of the most demanding parts of this algorithm, but here I'm going to show it to you. So for a single sequence here, we now generated all of the triplets of keys, of values, keys, and queries for each and every token. And now we're going to try to reorder the sequence. Now, if everything is just very, very boring and we're not going to reorder the sequence, the keys and values are going to have the keys and queries. This is the mistake I make very often. Please bear with me. So the keys and queries are going to have such a property that when you take a dot product, or cosine similarity as it's known, that then you're for the same word, okay, if it's going to be boring, for the same word you're going to have high similarity here, 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 and here, and for different words you're going to have a low similarity, like all of these other boxes right here and here. Now if we're going to switch the first word with the second word, then the key of the second word is going to, or the second token is going to actually have a high similarity with the query of the second token, okay, of the first token, sorry, first token. And then also the key of the first token is going to have a high similarity with the query of the second token. But these other ones that would usually be high would now be low. So the first the key of the first token would have a low similarity with the query of the first token. The key of the second token would have a low similarity with the query of the second token. So everything else pretty much can stay the same. So these are low, these are low, this is high, this is high, this is low, this is low. Okay, so that's how we switch the ordering of these things around. But before we go any further, okay, there's, for this whole matrice, there's something called like a softmax that gets applied, and I'm pretty sure you know what it is. It effectively just makes the high values higher and low values lower, and it's a mathematical operation that's differentiable, which is why it's often used in neural networks. But it's something that removes effectively any uncertainty in, so you really pick winners here. And so then when we actually reorder, we have a new reordering matrix, but we don't we generate the new sequence by using the values. Okay, so in fact then we're going to use, for the very first value that we go through, we evaluate all of these values that were generated by the softmax, and the first one comes up very low because we were switching around the order. So then the second one comes up very high, which means that the second value, the token, the value of the second token is gonna what is the value vector that is a result of weight matrix multiplication with the second token is going to be high. Okay, so this thing is going to be is going to generate token here, second token, okay, is going to generate this, and this is going to be a value number 2, and then that is going to be multiplied with a high number here, so it's going to be heavily weighted, and there's going to be a low number here and a low number here, so we're mostly weighing high value here for well, it's going to be mostly v2, but here for the second value in the sequence, it's actually going to be coming from the first value in the original sequence, so it's mostly going to be this, okay, and then this and this and this are going to come from this and this and this, but they're going to be low because not very heavily weighted into the total sum, because they're going to, you know, we're switched around the order of the sequence, so basically all of these are low here, and then on the softmax, and that makes them even lower. And then v3 is mostly going to be what's here, and v4 is mostly what's going to be here, and that's how we reorder things around. Now, to show you how they did this in the paper, okay, because you all have you know, IQs over 150. As soon as you see something like this, and maybe you need some extra help, and then you see something like this, you immediately see a picture of this. I mean, that's obvious. So but there is actually some things here that I didn't go through. So the query and the key vectors actually go through the matrix multiplication as I described, which gives you this huge matrix, and then these values actually need to be scaled, and they need to be scaled because the matrix itself can be larger or smaller, and depending on the size of the matrix itself you need to scale the numbers, because the bigger matrix is, you're going to have to consider many more numbers. So just because of that, there is a scaling that you need to take into account when dealing with these numbers. Now, secondly, there is they say here optional. There's a mask that you can optionally put in, and usually that mask covers like the upper triangle here, like this, and turns it all into zeros. So that forces certain kind of orderings to be impossible. Okay, and then yeah, the softmax, and which is here, which makes things more extreme, and then you have the matrix multiply, where you have the values multiplied by this matrix that's a consequence of all of these computations, and that's what I depicted here. Maybe it could be better depicted in some ways, but that's what it is right now. And there's another sort of, if you zoom out of this, okay, then you can put all of this into like this thing here, okay, and then you just say something like okay, you have a v, a key, value, a key, and query, and those are the consequence of multiplying a weight matrix by your tokens, and then you, well, actually there's this linear transform, so it's like a single layer neural network linear thing, and I didn't go into that a lot, but it doesn't change things a great deal. So there's a linear transformation, okay, that you can apply, okay, before you go through all of this, okay, and then you do the attention, okay, but these are all learned, all right, and the dynamics of all of this is set up in such a way that like backpropagation sort of gets in there and gets it's sort of really strange. Everything is set up so that backpropagation can wiggle the weights around and eventually really get a good handle on what every weight is for, and really use this architecture for what it is intended. So reordering things around and reassigning values. So that's the intuitive high-level design from our human end, but backpropagation has to figure it all out by just wiggling things with the error gradient. So but it actually manages to do that, which is kind of really remarkable. All right, so back to this. If you really want to know where a lot of very interesting things are happening, it's in this matrix right here. This calculation right here is an n-squared calculation. All right, and meaning if we have n tokens, then this is going to be an n-squared size. So it's going to eat up RAM and it's going to eat up compute, and that limits the amount of computation that is achievable with current techniques. And a lot of new stuff is coming up, and still a lot of it is very experimental, but there's a lot of potential to possibly turn this into an n log n computation, or maybe even just an n with a big constant. We don't know how far things will go and how general the solutions will be, but if this can be expanded beyond currently, like GPT-3 at this time does like 2,000 or so things in a sequence. So it's not a lot. There's some papers that propose these things being able to handle 64,000 things in a sequence, which is a lot more. You can start generating like little videos with that. Yeah, so if this gets reduced in computation and memory requirements, this architecture is really going to do impressive things. And it already does impressive things. It's not as good of a prior for like image processing as is the convolutional neural network, but it is far better than nothing at all. And it can actually perform a good job of modeling, so just like it does language modeling, where it can fill in the blanks and create the words that are supposed to be there. It can do the same thing for images and just fill in the blanks for like what's supposed to be in the image, if you just give it some areas where you ask it to fill in the areas. So then it's modeling the visual aspect of reality we live in. And if it can do video and audio, then it's modeling, most of the human experience pretty much, and that's pretty impressive. So, and very useful if you put it into a recurrent neural network and then train robots to, pre-train the robots to act in that world model. That would be, and update the world model with fine-tuning as it goes. But that's really a story for some other day, not today. So thank you very much for your attention, and that's it for now.